So thank you everybody for joining us today. There's been great interest in the first information session on the new legislation on auto pension enrolment. So today's topic is delivered by our presenter, Davin Spollen. And just to give you a little bit of an introduction in relation to Davin. Davin is CEO of Glennon Employee Benefits and is the current president and the associate of the Irish Institute of Pensions Management, a qualified pension trustee and certified financial planner. Davin also serves as Global Employee Benefits Advisory Council member to the Worldwide Broker Network, the largest international insurance intermediary network. He has served as Executive Board member to the Ascent Employee Benefits Network and as a core Employee Benefits Management team member of the Brokers Link International Network. So as you can see, you are in very good hands this afternoon. So if you can please post any questions you may have for Davin in the Q&A function, and at the end of the presentation, which will take about 45 minutes, Davin will get to your questions. We are recording today's session and we will send out a recording plus the PowerPoint presentation from today early next week. So thank you for attending, and over to Davin. Thank you.
Well, Michelle, thanks very much. That's quite the introduction, so it's really appreciated. And just to say, look, I really appreciate the invitation from the Law Society to come and speak to you today. Conscious that everybody's time, especially around lunchtime, is extremely precious, although probably less so since the advent of the pandemic. So I'm happy to take you through the new legislation and the implications for employers today. Just a quick shout out again to say thank you to the Law Society, Michelle Nolan, obviously Mary McNeese, Fiona, Shane and Martin for all the help with getting up and running for this. And also as president of the IIBM, we obviously value education and the academic achievements. So just a big shout out to I suppose your 49 recently qualified solicitors, which is a great achievement for them, and it's great to see new people coming into the business. I'm just going to start sharing my screen now, and Michelle, please let me know if there's any difficulties with anybody seeing this.
No, if you just press F5 there we go. That's perfect. Thank you. Excellent.
That's great. So listen, the agenda, I suppose it's quite a busy agenda. As Michelle said, I'll speak for about the next 40 odd minutes. Please type in questions as we go and I'll work through the agenda. You'll probably notice that I'll focus in on certain slides for a number of minutes, and certain slides we'll move through quickly, but please be assured I'll circulate the slides with the help of the Law Society after the session also. So what we're going to cover, I suppose, where it's at, what is it, why do we have it, what's the design of it. We're going to have a look at the bill and the various sections, so you'll have a familiarity of where to look for certain things. And ultimately, and the section I suppose I'll spend a lot of time on is what this will mean for employers and employees, who are the ones who are going to be affected by this. So look, it's been in the making for over 20 years now at this stage in various forms. And a lot of work has gone into this, and Tim Duggan and Colin Walsh and a lot of the people at the Department of Social Protection and the Department of Finance, Revenue, there's been a huge number of contributors to this. And a fantastic job has been done, and we'll talk about why it's been done in a moment. And our current understanding, I suppose, is that it's due to commence at the end of September 2025, and we'll talk through the logistics of that. Just to say, look, this is absolutely transformative. This is huge generational change for an industry that has gone through so much recently, as you'll all be aware of the transposition of the IRPS 2 Pensions Directive into Irish law. And that's seen a huge, I suppose, shift in approach to pension scheme saving in Ireland, with a lot of employer schemes moving from their own single employer trust into master trusts as a result. And this is just going to, I suppose, bring another layer and level entirely to what is going on in the pensions world in Ireland when we think of pensions and retirement saving in general. But ultimately, it is an utter good. It is something that's going to deal with a very significant problem, as we'll talk about in a moment. So what is it? Basically, people who are not in a pension scheme will be compulsorily enrolled into a brand new system, and people who aren't actively contributing on a monthly basis. It'll be run by a new state agency called NERSA, which is the snazzy way of saying the National Auto Enrolment Retirement Savings Authority. And there'll be an employer and an employee contribution required, plus a contribution from the state, excuse me. It'll be invested in the same way that most pension schemes are run currently. We've moved, I suppose, beyond the world of defined benefit. And now we have the defined contribution where people contribute money. The money's invested. We know what's going in. We don't know what the outcome will be. and that's how the investment process works. We just see what comes out at the other end. The pots, once they're commenced within the NERSA and within the auto enrollment or My Future Fund system, will effectively follow the member. So when somebody goes into this system that's run by the state agency, they will have that retirement pot from day one to the end of their working life. And just to be aware of that. The benefits for this and how people will take it at retirement will be relatively similar to the current structure for PRSAs. And just a huge reminder, I suppose, for those of you who are possibly feeling your collars tighten a little bit because you've got your own pension schemes and you're wondering what this means for you. This is an employee-centric system, not an employer-centric system. And that's really important because it means that there are going to be unintended consequences when a system like this is implemented and applied unilaterally across the board to everybody who isn't saving on a monthly basis via payroll. And they could be within any kind of employment where there's pension schemes on offer on a voluntary basis, a non-compulsory basis, and that means those individuals, because they're not in it, will be pulled in. So look, why have it? I mean, 56% of our total working population have some form of pension, but really what we're talking about is the 2/3 in the private sector who have no pension really to speak of, who have very little interaction with pensions, and they number about 800,000 employees in Ireland, and that's enormous. I mean, that's a massive, massive gap for those 800,000 people. What are they going to live on when they get to retirement age 66? We know what the state pension is currently, about 14 odd grand. So it's a huge, I suppose, demographic time bomb. And I suppose in a time where I suppose currently there's 5 workers for every state pensioner, that's going to reduce to 2 over the next 20 odd years. I saw a statistic recently published, I think it was the ESRI, that said in order to maintain the state pension, we're going to need 7.7 million active employees by 2050. And we're projecting to have 3.7. So that's enormous. So what's it going to do, I suppose, to the state pension system when it becomes unaffordable? Already we're moving from a status of having people who may not qualify for the full state pension, and it'll be more difficult as we get to a total contributions approach, and that system of calculating someone's state pension entitlement is changing. And also, as we talked about a few years ago, will the state pension age be pushed up? So could we all be working to 67, 68 and beyond when we get to that point where we need to take the state pension? That's a really important thing to just think about, even from your own perspective. If you're the slightly younger ilk, possibly even a little bit younger than me, just to bear in mind, currently the state pension age is 66, 14 odd grand. That could move out and you couldn't to 67, 68 or beyond, and you may not qualify for the full amount. So just to factor a lot of those things into your own personal thinking around retirement saving, in addition to understanding, I suppose, what auto enrollment is. So this is it. I suppose when we finish the session today and you want to wonder again what it is and how it all works and who it applies to, I suppose this is the slide to go to. It basically is very busy, but it'll tell you who it applies to. So all employees who are not in a pension currently, saving on a monthly basis through payroll, they'll be automatically enrolled. They will be mandatory enrollment, but they'll have a potential to opt out in months 7 and 8 after they've been enrolled. And every 2 years, they'll be re-enrolled. And that's just the way it's going to work. And what happened, I suppose, in the UK experience when they introduced this 13 odd years ago, is that people were worn down. So where there were people who opted out of pension saving through the auto enrollment system, once they began to be re-enrolled, effectively they got fatigued and they ended up staying in, which meant that it persisted. It's going to apply for everybody between the ages of 23 and 60. And they're going to look at that basically at the end of September. They're going to look back 13 weeks and say, right, who amongst the workforce who's aged 23 to 60, earning over 20K, is not saving on a monthly basis into a pension? Okay, well, they're all going into auto enrollment, and employers and companies will receive a notification very similar to the revenues approach with RPN, but it'll be an AE payment notification to say that Davin Spollen is now enrolled, and here's what you need to do on a monthly basis. As I said, it's a defined contribution system, so the money's collected, it's taken in, and it's invested, and there's a matching contribution, which we'll talk about in a minute. Strangely, there's a state contribution rather than any income tax relief. So ordinarily, as we all know, an employer can put into a pension scheme. There's no tax implication of the money going in. The employee can put in and gets full income tax relief up to their revenue age-related limits. Under the system, there won't be any income tax relief for the employee portion. It'll be a calculation based on the gross salary, but taken from the net pay. And it'll commence at 1.5% and increase to 6% over a period of 10 years. With the government contribution, it'll be an equivalent to 14% by year 10. There's going to be a limit. So we're used to kind of salary cap limits in the private sector, 115K maximum salary cap for own contributions. Well, under this system, it's going to be a total salary cap for 80K. If you earn above that under this system and you're in it, the employer and employee contribution in the first year would be 1.5% up to 80K max, even though you earn a lot more. So that's really important. There'll be centralized processing again, so that's taken in by NERSA, a limited choice investments. We'll touch on things like the funds and the tax exemption now in a second, and the funds will follow the member in the one pot, and benefits similar to the PRSA again. Take 25% as a lump sum, and move the rest to an ARF or take it as a taxable cash or buy an annuity. This is, I suppose, what the bill looks like. So if you're looking for kind of a cheat sheet of where to go to in terms of understanding the bill, these are the main areas. But there's a huge focus, I suppose, on administration, communication, and enforcement. And there are the various parts to it. This is really, really important. I suppose this is where we talk about who's going to be included. So while there is, I suppose, the 23 to age 60 criteria and 20K from all employments. So for instance, if you have an employee who works for you and you pay them 10,000 a year and they're on a part-time basis and they're earning 10,001 somewhere else or 10,000 somewhere else, then both employments will be subject to this. So they'll be looking at total earnings by individual, and people who are working but under the age of 23 or above the age of 60 can opt into the system. So even though you have employees who are not quite fitting the criteria, there will be an opt-in, and that's really important to understand. And once eligibility is triggered, they're in the system. However, they can be moved out of the system, and they can pause their contributions and they can opt out. And we'll talk a little bit more about the logistics of that now in a moment. This is really important, I suppose. Exempt employment, I suppose, really is the qualifying criteria for that is actively contributing to a pension. And that can be a PRSA, it can be an occupational pension scheme, it can be a PRSA with an employee-only contribution, it can be a pension scheme with an employer-only contribution, or a combination of employer and employee with AVCs. So what we're saying really for the first 6 odd years of the auto-enrollment implementation, if it commences in September 2025, is that whatever you're doing now currently, as long as it's done via payroll into an approved pension scheme or PRSA, that will be sufficient for you to be exempted from this. And the employer will not receive a notification regarding you. So you could be putting in 1%, or your employer could be putting in 1%, or you could each be putting in 1% on a monthly basis. And that's absolutely fine. Just to be aware, I suppose self-employed people also are exempt. So if you're PRSI code S, you will not be pulled into this system. The opt-out windows, again, it's really important. And I think it'll be something that is going to be asked about again and again and again, but mainly by employees. So I suppose when you're looking at the system and the process, and we expect a bombardment of communication and information to employers from the government when, I suppose, the hard and fast age is truly known, this is going to be one of the things that everybody asks you about. I suppose if they're in your employment, they're going to be wondering how this all works. So if they opt out at month 6, or at the end of month 6, in month 7 and month 8, they can get the value of their own contributions back, but the employer contribution and the state contribution stays in. So there's going to be little pots. And I suppose this is going to be really interesting because as we have people who potentially come to Ireland for seasonal work, earning above the 20K salary cap, we're possibly going to end up with a significant number of little auto-enrollment pots, and with tens and thousands over time of pots that may never be claimed and will just be working away in the system. this again is really, really important. So I suppose differing from how most pension schemes in Ireland work currently, most pension schemes will be set up on a voluntary membership basis. So look, you come in the door, here's our pension scheme, you need to take an action to join it. And our pensionable salary in the main for most schemes tends to be base salary. So under the auto-enrolment system, it's going to be total earnings, so total emolument. So every, I suppose, taxable element under Schedule E is going to form the basis for the contribution rates here. And as we see in the first 3 years, as the state eases us all into this world, it's quite low, quite meager. I suppose at 1.5% employer, it's not insignificant. It is a cost, definitely, and that the employers will have to start thinking about that cost as it potentially bears in at the end of September, and the employees themselves as well. Many of whom, if we think of the 800,000 employees, have never been in a pension scheme at all. So it's going to be a little bit of a surprise, especially for lower income earners who see a 1.5% of total earnings gross equivalent subtracted from their net pay. So just to bear that in mind, with an equivalent kind of top up from the government of 0.5%, which gives an effect of if you like, a 25% income tax relief. And that's how it's calculated. And as you can see, it starts to get stronger and stronger and stronger as the years go by, as people get used to it. Like pension saving itself, the first month you start into a pension, you see the deduction, and then after a couple of months you're used to it, and you keep going, you persist with it. Starting is the hard bit. I suppose the same with this. And again, like many other jurisdictions around the world, and like thinking of Australia, for instance, would be one where it's an employer-heavy contribution, but they began to increase contributions to it just to get people, I suppose, in the door, used to it, and then they start to ratchet it up. Because in reality, if people were enrolled at 20, at 1.5 and 1.5, and a 0.5 state kick in, I mean, they're not really going to have much of a pension at the end of the day to speak of over their working life. However, it will start to become more significant for them for contribution rates at year 10. And just, I suppose, the question that I've been asked an awful lot is, what happens, I suppose, let's say I'm a new employer and I'm starting on day dot, and I'm forced into the system. It's not the start date of your company commencing business, it's the status of the scheme. So if it's September 25 and we're 4 years on from that, it's 3 and 3, regardless of where you set up when you set up your business. So that's really important. So again, there are employers that are making calculations, they're looking at this and going, okay, we have some people in our scheme, is the state system the right one for me? Recognizing that when we run at 1.5% down the cost line, our scheme is set up on base salary, and the government scheme is set up on total emoluments, and we have lots of bonuses and things. So they're taking a calculating approach to say, what's actually going to be cheaper for us for the next 6 years? Is it going to be rowing in with this approach? And again, I had this discussion with Tim Duggan, I suppose, the Department of Social Protection, just around, I suppose, the thinking around the structures of this. And Tim's view was, look, we're trying to make this system foolproof for employers who've never had pension schemes before. It would be a great result if we covered off the 800,000 workers, even if 200,000 of those ended up effectively in their own employer scheme, where they have a different regime. But again, it's the idea is to get everybody saving into a pension scheme. And I suppose to eliminate what we've had for many years, the kind of the in or the out approach, where people simply don't commit to it. And most people don't join the pension scheme until they're in their late 30s in reality. So if you got everybody in and used to pension saving and talking about it from the early age of 23, that would be a fantastic result in totality. This is really important because while we all know that 88 to 90% of pension scheme members end up in what's called a default investment fund, they have no interest in how the money is invested. They simply go with, say, a lifestyle arrangement where, as they're younger, their money is invested in riskier assets like stocks and shares. And as they get a little bit older, this default lifestyle target dated fund effectively de-risks them as they move towards retirement. I suppose in line with a lot of people's approach to their concern around risk, you know, as we get older, we're more risk averse. And risk, I suppose, really is just, in my view, is just uncertainty of outcome. The higher the risk element, the higher the uncertainty of outcome, the higher the potential benefit, but also there can be negative years as well. So some people are concerned about that. And under this system, it'll be a similar approach. There's going to be some monies coming in, potentially to 4 investment managers. They take in €100 from the employer and the employee, €25 to each investment manager, put into a target dated risk lifestyle fund. and that money is invested over the period. And as people kind of get closer to retirement, they're de-risked. So how does that stack up, I suppose, to what we're currently used to? So if all of us are probably used to a pension scheme of some form, and some of us may not be. So you might be in a pension scheme with Aviva, with New Ireland, with Zurich, with Irish Life, with some other entity, and you'll have probably between 13 and 30 funds to choose from potentially. And you might look at those funds and say, well, look, I've got a lifestyle fund, and then there's the 10% who really are actively at choosing their funds. No, I want to be in a high risk global equity fund or something of that nature. I want to pick my own funds. Under the auto-enrollment system, it's envisaged that everybody will start in this default lifestyle fund. There'll be very little choice initially, and then over time there'll be a low, a medium, and a high risk fund available. But it'll be relatively, I suppose, black box initially. The money will be dispersed between 4 investment managers, and then the outcome of the investments will be, I suppose, printed and issued on an electronic or hard copy annual benefit statement. And this is really important because communication has been such a focus. Communication engagement for pensions in general in the industry has been an enormous focus, I suppose, of the Pensions Authority, of the new transposed directive. So communication, it's no surprise here that there's a lot of the bill that is dedicated to that, to ensure that members know what's going on with their money. So if you're in the AE system, the default stance will be you'll receive electronic communications. Again, we're not quite sure how this is going to be achieved in terms of the transfer of information. We understand that the Payroll Association is speaking with the Department of Social Protection, and this will be, I suppose, working with the administrator for the system, which is TCS. We'll cover that in a minute, to understand what information is going to be provided. And I suppose theoretically, you would expect that the details of the person, the name, and possibly the address, the PPSN, and the email address, the mobile telephone number would be required in order to, I suppose, have a meaningful record of the member and be able to communicate electronically. So electronically will be the way, and people will receive an annual benefit statement electronically. The authority will also maintain a website where they're planning to, I suppose, have lots of different helpful videos to explain things. Individuals may apply for other means of communication, i.e. they could request hard copy printed annual benefit statements and forms of communication. And they could request them Oscailga as well, which I think is important. And I suppose the regularity of that is yet to be taken into account, but certainly 12-month annual benefit statements will be produced and will be similar, I suppose, to what we have in the private sector currently. So as we all know, for members of pension schemes, receive an annual benefit statement. It'll have your information. It'll show you what you put in over the last 12 months. It'll show you what your current fund value is at the point of printing. It'll also project and give you a statement of reasonable projection of what you could expect if you continued along that road up until your normal retirement age. And I suppose that we're also moving to a world where we're going to be required to produce optimistic valuations and less optimistic valuations or projections. It'll show you what the risk category is, again, thinking back to that slide about one default investment category, and then having 3 different funds, low, medium, high risk, that you may elect to choose, and what the expenses will be applied. And again, we'll cover that off in a minute, how they're going to basically recoup money to run the scheme. And this is significant, I suppose. There's a lot of this is dedicated to enforcement to make sure that we don't have rogue employers who are receiving electronic communications to tell them to do things through their various, there's up to 20, I think there's 20 payroll software packages in the market. And I suppose the system that's been designed for auto-enrollment is trying to work out how it interacts with these different payroll software packages. So again, a lot of that is going to, I suppose, drive the inclusion of individuals into the scheme. And I suppose where employers are not towing the line and not actually engaging or not actually remitting the money, which, as we all know, is a really fundamental part of pension saving, there's going to be authorised officers with significant powers to enter premises and to look at documents and interrogate staff, compliance notices. There could be fixed penalties, a naughty list of some kind. There'll be protection, I suppose, for employees through the WRC. And there'll be a list of offences and penalties. I suppose the what happens now bit, I suppose, is quite important. So as it stands, the state entity NERSA has to be staffed. So they need to appoint a CEO. They need to go out to public appointments to appoint an external board, and they need to bring in all, I suppose, all the people who are going to work in it, and they're going to hire that pool from the civil service. They have appointed a third-party administrator, Tata Consulting Services, and we'll cover that off in a moment. And they need to select investment providers, of whom they can choose up to 4. They need to, I suppose, have the negotiation with those investment managers then. What are the charges? There was a talk of, I suppose, a 0.5% management charge, which would be, I suppose, at the median level, and possibly a little bit lower for the private sector pension schemes. And will there be a monthly policy fee levied? How is this basically all going to be paid for? And initially, I think it's going to be a large expenditure, but over time, as the funds begin to develop, as the scheme grows, and when you get up to significant hundreds of thousands of members now participating, effectively it'll become the largest pension scheme in the state. But for those who are coming in at the ground floor, where there's no funds now in, and there's a lot of work to be done, I suppose it'll take an awfully long time to recoup and to actually make any money from this. And they have to, I suppose, issue contracts and SLAs, have all of that information in place, and develop the website and the communication materials, actually start that process of communication. And I was a little bit surprised when, I think it was October, November, I heard an ad on the radio saying, auto enrollment is coming soon, make sure you're aware. And I think that was when the deadline was January 1. I think there may have been a delay in pulling that particular ad. Employers and employees have to be educated. So you don't want to be an employer who's going to be caught flat-footed by this and not understand it at all. And I suppose that's why we're all here. And you want to be ready to answer the questions that employees will have, i.e., what's this auto enrollment about? Why are you taking my money? Or how come I'm in your scheme? And I think in the auto enrollment scheme, you get a better deal because there's money going in from the employer. So being educated about the actual implications of this is hugely important. Software integrations, again, incredibly important. It can't work without that. And look, it all has to happen by September 2025 or the end of. So there's a huge amount to be done. So getting the skates on, I think, will it be pushed out? I think we were told recently that it's expected to start. It would be hard enough to see how there's a lot to be done in fairness. So it could potentially be pushed out. But I suppose to be reasonable and scientific about it, because we've been told it is going to start, we have to plan for it. The administration of this, i.e. the technology, has been outsourced to Tata Consulting Services. And Tata, to be fair, are fairly renowned. I mean, they're an Indian-based technology company, and they have significant experience, I suppose, working in the UK. And they set up the UK's NEST system, which is one of their master trusts for auto enrollment. And so I suppose they have quite a lot of experience in dealing with mass market administration of pension schemes, albeit what we're doing now in Ireland as a result of the design is actually quite different to the UK. Again, thinking back to the idea of it differs in terms of tax relief. It differs, I suppose, in approach where it's an individualistic approach where employers don't elect to become part of the scheme. Effectively, individuals are targeted and brought into the scheme. And again, I suppose the whole thinking here is we have to bring a lot of people, 800,000 people, into pension saving. And we can't rely on people just signing up and joining employers' voluntary schemes where they're even available, or signing up for an employer's PRSA again, and more worryingly, where they're even available. So again, it's a system that has its quirks. I don't agree with some of the design. I agree with a lot of the design, and I certainly agree with the government doing it. And I certainly agree with the approach that it has to be kind of a very much look, it's all done for you. Here's your notification, pay the money over. And I would agree with that approach, especially for those employments who've never had a pension scheme and they've never considered having one. Okay, so this is really important again. So implications for existing schemes, and just to hark back to one of my initial slides. If you have a scheme currently, that's fine. And the main thing I suppose you really need to consider around your existing scheme and what you're doing currently, because you're probably contributing as an employer in some fashion, or you might be a member of a scheme and you're actively contributing on a monthly basis. I think that's really important. But what employers now that have schemes and they want to make sure they're still fit for purpose is they need to really analyze the participation rates of their schemes. So if you have 100 staff and you have 60 people in your scheme, you need to think about that, because you've probably got 40 people who could then potentially be pulled into auto-enrollment if they don't join your scheme prior to the implementation date. So you need to understand the costs of that at the current, I suppose, eligibility criteria and contribution rates. And you need to consider the cost of the government system at 1.5% years 1 to 3 of total earnings from an employer contribution perspective. So that's really important. You need to then consider and try and fast forward, if you can, to year 7, where they may impose standards on your scheme. So they might say, well, look, Davin, your scheme's paying 1% employer, 1% employee into your scheme. That's great. But from year 7, you're going to have to be up at 5 and 5, 6 and 6, 7 and 7. The minister will determine what the criteria and the standards are. So that it's really important just to understand how your scheme shapes up and think a little bit further ahead, because ultimately you could end up in a situation where you have a requirement to have a total 14% contribution going in. And how is that funded? And will the government impose a larger responsibility on the employer contribution? We don't know, but it's important to just think about those kind of things. Waiting periods, again, any company, I suppose, that has a probationary period or a waiting period to join their scheme, we're now, I suppose, staring down September 25. Possibly take advice and consider your position with regard to that, because you may want to start enrolling people into your own scheme if you don't want to work with auto-enrollment as a possibility. Tax inequity, I suppose, talking to people, especially people who earn over 44K, remembering that there's a 40% income tax relief for people on pension contributions above that level of salary. And under the current system, the incoming system, it'll be an equivalent to 25%. And again, at a much lower contribution rate in the early years. So there's things to think about. Conversely, also to think about the inequity of taking money from net pay versus gross pay. So just another thing. People opting out of schemes, again, just to look at the process there and understand it, because if they opt out of your scheme and they're contributing on a monthly basis, or they take a payment holiday. So for instance, somebody goes to buy a house and they go to their mortgage broker. The mortgage broker says, that's great, but we need 3 pay slips. So we need you to stop contributing to your pension so we can see 3 nice and clear pay slips. When auto-enrollment comes in, if they stop contributing to your scheme, they'll be pulled into auto-enrollment. An unintended consequence, but they'll be pulled in because they've ceased their contributions. So things of that nature. And just to, I suppose, have a regard to the good work you've been doing over the many decades. For many of you on the call today, if you've been offering a pension scheme, you've included employees and you put a lot of work into your pension scheme, you might still be standalone as in a single employer trust, and you might still be a trustee, for instance, or you might be in another arrangement. But like, if you've put a lot of work into your pension scheme, I suppose it will potentially impact your benefits philosophy in your workplace. Look, we're all, I suppose, when we think about the employer mindset, we're all trying to attract and retain the best staff that we have. And how do you do that? I suppose by having good benefits, a good pension scheme, good death in service, good income protection, things of that nature. When you have that, I suppose, do you want to dilute that offering by potentially having accidental members of auto-enrollment? You have somebody in to give a pension presentation to your staff, and a number of people in the room are in auto-enrollment. So think again, it could be an opportunity to take stock. If you've never done anything about pensions for your staff or even for yourself, now's the time, I suppose, to think about it, because we think pensions will be discussed, I suppose, more broadly, we think, although we always tend to think of ourselves as being the most interesting business, and I know definitely the pensions industry, we're not. But just think about, I suppose, your setup currently, how you use the tools at your disposal to keep your staff and keep them happy. Because when auto-enrollment comes in, everybody will know the design of that, and people may talk about their pensions in a different way and say, well, oh, I'm in the AE system. Oh, well, I'm in an employer scheme and I'm getting 6 and 6. You know, these kind of conversations could be more frequent. This is, again, when you think about this presentation and the slides, this is probably one that's going to be most of interest to members of pension schemes. So for instance, if you were engaging with your population of your staff, or if you yourself are a member of a pension scheme and you simply want to understand what the differences are, this is kind of the main place to go. So the main differences here, in very brief, I suppose, because I'm just conscious of all of our time, is, look, retirement, no early retirement is going to be possible under the AE system. So people are going to work to state pension age, currently 66. So if you're in auto-enrollment, as it stands today, you would currently have to wait till 66 to access your money. If you're in an occupational pension scheme, potentially you could go from age 50 and take early retirement. And we know with certainty that a lot of employees don't tend to go at that early retirement point, but they love the idea of it. And some people certainly, when I give presentations on client sites, they will say, look, I'll say, when do you want to retire? Some people put their hand up and say, today, tomorrow, as soon as I can, from age 50, from age 55, from 60. You have that, I suppose, under your own scheme, under your control. But under the new system, the AE system, that won't be a possibility. So just to bear that in mind. We've talked a little bit about the income, the impact on take-home pay. One really important element of this is, look, we all know now that the 1.5% ratchets up to 6%, with a total 14% over 10 years with the government kick in. There won't be an ability. So if you have people in there who are getting into their late 30s and early 40s and beyond, they really want to start pension savings. So the AE system in the early years, the early iterations, won't cater to that in the way that a private pension scheme will. And that's really important, because understanding your participation rates of your pension scheme is one step, but understanding your demographic, your employee demographic, is really important, because if you've got a lot of people in their 20s, that's fine. They're not going to be that interested anyway. But if you've a lot of people in their 30s and 40s and beyond, they're going to start to get really interested in pension saving. And auto-enrollment, I suppose, is going to tie their hands for the early years, because they won't be able to contribute additionally, and they're going to be tied into that rigid contribution structure. Investment selection, the noisy 10% who are really into their investments, auto-enrollment is not going to necessarily float their boat. Advice and contact, I suppose, website for the AE system, possibly a call center, and just to plug our own services, I suppose, when you have a broker like Glennon, we can come out and engage one-to-one with employees at different life stages. People in their 20s, look, get in there. If you start now, you're going to have a great retirement. People coming up to retirement, think about what you're doing. How are you going to spend the money? What do you need in retirement, and where are you going to retire? Stuff like that is possible, I suppose, from an advice perspective when you have your own scheme. Retirement options and transfer portability. Again, I'm not going to labor through this, but in your own pension scheme, if it's an occupational pension scheme, you'll have different retirement options available, especially to longer serving employees, and the ability to transfer previous scheme benefits in, out, other jurisdictions pre-retirement, if they have a similar enough setup in terms of an occupational pension scheme and it's permitted, whereas transfers out of AE won't be permitted, and transfers in from other schemes won't be permitted. So effectively, the AE system, the My Future Fund, won't interact with other systems of pension saving. Again, the brief summary of the implications for employees. Like, I simply cannot understate the importance of this, because no matter what you do, whether you have your own scheme or not, if you're an employer, employees are going to come and ask you this stuff, and they're going to want to know what the story is, how it all works, and what are the limitations. Are there better things available? How do things work? So again, thinking back to the questions that might arise for you, and maybe for your payroll or HR function, or anybody that you interact with, or even if you're just a person here joining today as an individual, just to understand, I suppose, the differences and limitations. And look, it's completely understandable the way it's been designed. Again, not to harp on, but it's been designed in such a way that it's effectively foolproof for employers. And again, thinking that it was designed for the vast majority of employees who have never had a pension scheme and are never going to be offered one. Again, this is really, really important. Like, from a cost basis, thinking back to the participation rate, we have a lot of clients who are in various sectors: technology, manufacturing, legal, professional services, you name it. And we're encountering, I suppose, participation rates between about 50 and 80%, which means there's still an enormous cohort between 50 and 20% that aren't in the pension scheme. So a lot of employers are straggling around going, right, what way do we do this? We have to maybe get Davin and the team in to discuss, our scheme, promote it, get people interested in it, and get them to sign up to it, so that they're in a pension scheme when this thing rolls out. Or do we consider, well, we've told people about our scheme, maybe we just let them at it. The world's not going to end when auto-enrollment starts, so anybody who hasn't taken the time to join our scheme will just end up in auto-enrollment, and we'll live with it. And there's certain employers in certain sectors where possibly there's a high turnover of staff, or there's seasonality or lower pay, that might say that's absolutely fine. They're not too concerned. But for the majority of people, I suppose, in your area in particular, where there are high achievers, there's, I suppose, really successful people that you want to look after, AE is not going to be the thing for you. It's not going to be the best use of that person's time or money, in terms of, because they're probably high earners who will do far better with an employer contribution and a 40% income tax relief. And again, coming back to thinking about your benefits philosophy, and if you're supposed to talking to clients in regard to this, and people are asking you about views on the approach here, I suppose it's just to understand primarily what their sector is, what their attract and retain goal is, and where are they hiring from. I suppose just to get a sense that the big topics for employers is really pension should be a way to get people to attract staff, retain staff, but also should be a good for the employee themselves who's been long serving potentially and deserves, I suppose, to have a period in their life where they can stop working and afford to live. I suppose there is obviously a big need to engage with employees, and for people to seek advice on their approach, and that obviously can flow into, I suppose, the contract law area as well, which is incredibly important. So I think there's potentially quite a significant opportunity for you as practitioners to speak to employers and to guide them on that journey, the whole kind of employment contract area. You know, do we go through a large exercise of making it mandatory to become a member of the pension scheme and change all of the existing contracts, or do we do that for new hires, or do we try and persuade people in? And if they won't go in, and we definitely don't want to have two systems running, then do we have an employer-only contribution category where there's no cost to the employee and we put them in the scheme? Are employers happy running two different schemes? Some may be, depending on the sector they're in. A lot of the employers we speak to aren't necessarily that happy about it, and a lot of them are scrambling to ensure that they get 100% participation. But just to give everybody, I suppose, on the call comfort, when this does happen, if it, let's say for argument's sake, it does happen on September 25, and you're not quite ready, or you haven't taken the steps, and you find yourself a little bit behind, the world is not going to end. All that's simply going to happen is you're going to have a number of your staff go into auto-enrollment, and maybe that wasn't intended, until such a time as they re-enter exempt employment, i.e. they join your pension scheme. If you, let's say you're at the last day before the implementation and you haven't taken any steps, that's all that's going to happen. You just have to, I suppose, go through the process of so I certainly don't want to fearmonger anybody and say, look, the world is going to end at the end of September 25 if you don't do X, Y, and Z. Quite the contrary. Don't worry too much about it, but it's great to be ahead of things. So do take the time and take this as an opportunity and a prompt, in the same way that issuing an annual benefit statement every year for a pension scheme is the opportunity to consider what you're doing and what you're contributing to your pension and looking at the values for potentially for retirement. This is kind of another hallmark for pension, because people, I see it all the time, people attend pension presentations, they get really excited, they make an AVC and they do lots of other things, and then they move on, they forget about it. And the only time they think about it again is when they get their annual benefit statement, or when somebody like us comes in and talks to them about it. So take this, I suppose, as an opportunity to consider your own situation with your own staff, your own employees and yourselves, and also what you're doing with your own pension, because it's important to save for retirement. But there's lots of things to think about. We'll take some Q&A now, and just to be assured that we will circulate the deck, just to Michelle's original point, if anybody's question we don't get to, or somebody has to drop off, don't be too worried, because we will circulate a document around afterwards that addresses the questions that are hanging out there. So I might just take a look through.
Great, thank you. There's actually quite a number of questions in there, probably following a number of similar themes, Davin, so I'll leave it to you to answer a couple of them. And those that we don't get to this afternoon, as you say, we'll send them out in a follow-up email.
Yes, so the first one, I suppose, it's a really good one, actually. The first one is in relation to somebody who's sourced their own pension, an employee, but they're actually funding a pension privately outside of payroll. That's really important, because that won't be recognised under the auto-enrollment system. So you're going to have somebody who has potentially always had their own little kind of side deal, their own private pension that they're funding out of their bank account and reclaiming tax. The system won't pick that up. So effectively, they'll be put into auto-enrollment as well, until such a time as they're in a scheme that's run through payroll. So there's one here about Auto-enrollment scheme applies to UK employers with employees working from home. Yes, in Ireland. So anybody basically that's tax resident in Ireland, i.e. is paying tax to the revenue commissioners as an employee, is absolutely included, certainly. What happens to the pension pot if the employee dies? Again, it was just something I heard recently that it would be paid to the family and the dependents, but apparently, as it stands currently, it would be subject to income tax of the recipient. However, I understand that is something that will be addressed, and I will bring an equalisation to the same way that potentially if somebody dies as a scheme member and they have a spouse who could receive the pension tax-free. So I think that will be addressed, but it's just one to keep an eye on. Yeah, so that's a good one. Yeah, so does this auto-enrollment scheme apply for employees who can only join the company pension scheme after they pass probation 6 months? It does. So it's just, again, it's making sure that you take a view on that. You might have to instruct, if you want to remove that waiting period, your trustees. You might have to amend your documentation, your hire documents and all of the rest. So your contracts of employment going forward, potentially to address that and enable people to join, so that if you definitely don't want to run it, I think that's really important. There's one here in relation to the Mercer scheme. I'll take that one separately, actually, and I'll just come back on that by way of email, if that's okay. Can an employee leave an existing occupational scheme and insist on joining the AE scheme? Yeah, it does. You're right. It does depend on the scheme rules and I suppose the employment contract. So if it is mandatory, that then potentially they would be in breach of contract if they did. If they opted out from an existing employer, again, it would depend on what I suppose approach the employers decided to take. If it is an employer who has taken a proactive measure to change contracts of employment and make it mandatory to join the scheme, yeah, it would. I think what you're likely to find in those scenarios is that once an employee understands the differences between the two systems, and let's say in that case that the employer is making a 5% pension contribution currently, if they understand that there's a 1.5% only employer contribution, and they can't early retire, there's no investment fund, or very little investment fund choices, and they're high income tax earner, and the income tax relief is going to be significant. So I think once the employee reviews that slide that we saw, which is the grid slide, your scheme versus the AE system, assuming it's an occupational pension scheme or possibly a PRSA, that then I think that they might make their own decision and make the right one, I think, if that makes sense. Yeah, so again, another one about the personal pension. So yeah, it's not recognised. And in fact, one of the questions that was put to the policy leader of the DSB was, can people fund into a PRSA and also be member their own PRSA and be a member of auto-enrollment to the revenue maximum limits? And theoretically, yes. For the initial period, you could potentially be a member of AE and also make maximum age-related revenue and permitted contributions to the separate arrangement.
Thank you. Thank you, Davin. We're losing your sound just a little bit there, so I might just end the call around here. We've lots more questions we currently have 17 more to answer. So what we're going to do is, as Davin said, we're going to go through all those questions anonymously and give you the responses to them in our follow-up email next week, so nobody's going to miss out on anything. So thank you so much, Davin. Really appreciated that. Really very helpful. I'll be sending it around to a few more people in the Law Society. And if anybody on the call has ideas for other programs or information sessions you'd like to see us run, we are going to just do an ad hoc session basis. So when you have some topic you'd like, we'll run for you in the coming months. Okay. So thank you all very much for your time today, and particularly Davin, I appreciate it. And we will be in touch early next week. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.